On Friday, I talked to you about an elderly man who was rushed to hospital. And if you haven't listened to my sermon from Friday, I invite you to do that now. This man was rushed to hospital with what was later confirmed to be COVID-19. And we spoke about the distress and fear his family felt about it all, especially because there is a good chance that they will never see him alive again. He may indeed die alone. And at the end of the story, his life still hung in the balance, in intensive care, on a ventilator, alone, and separated from all those that he loves. But there is another part to the story, and that is the part where his family, and they're a family of doctors, where his family talks about how they are trying to save his life. And because we don't have a vaccine yet, and we don't have very many effective drugs to cure COVID-19, this family of doctors have been looking into some treatments which are not used very much today, but were much common in the past, especially 100 years ago. And there's one treatment which they were looking into which gives them hope, and it's called a plasma transfusion. Now, basically, a plasma transfusion is a partial blood transfusion, where the blood of someone who has had a disease and then recovered from it, this blood is injected into a patient who is very ill, someone who has the disease or is at least susceptible to getting it very badly, someone who might get very, very ill. Now, these days, it's only part of the blood that would be transfused, the plasma, and we hope that this plasma, which will have some antibodies, which will then fight the virus in the sick person. But in earlier times, we didn't have the facilities to separate the plasma out, and a whole blood transfusion was given. Now, I want to be clear. There is no evidence at this stage that this kind of treatment will do anything in COVID-19. But it has definitely helped in some cases in previous epidemics. It was definitely used during the Spanish flu epidemic, which was exactly 100 years ago. And we believe the Chinese doctors are testing it out at the moment. In fact, the US government has permitted blood transfusions as an emergency treatment for patients who are going downhill very fast. Keep your eyes and ears open to see if indeed it proves helpful. When I first heard the story, I was initially fascinated by the whole science aspect of it. That something in your blood could help my body to fight disease. But as I thought about it further, as I considered it more deeply, I was struck by just how poetic it all is. That by donating our blood, the very stuff that makes us alive, we might help others live longer, better lives. Now, this is something that Christians should understand. The reading for this morning, for this Easter morning, is Matthew's account of the empty tomb and the first encounter of the women with the risen Christ. And it is an account filled with great joy and energy. But one thing that Matthew emphasizes over all the other Gospels, especially over Mark's Gospel, is the great purpose for the disciples. A great purpose for the disciples and indeed all creation that is signified by the empty tomb. Matthew's reveal is accompanied by an earthquake and an angel, clearly acknowledged, and then the women are given clear directions. Compare that to Mark's Gospel, where the whole thing is much more mysterious, muted if you like, and the resurrection awareness gradually seeps into our bones. And I like this about Mark's Gospel. But you can't go past Matthew for clarity. Those rocks that Jesus said would cry out when everyone else is silent, back on Palm Sunday, well, as the stone is rolled back, the rocks do indeed cry out, and prophecy is fulfilled again. All of this then leads in turn to the Great Commission in chapter 28. The Great Commission to make disciples of all nations and all peoples, because Jesus has all authority in heaven and on earth. Can you recognize the energy and the purpose and direction of it all? Yes, the tomb is empty. Jesus is alive once more, and that is wonderful. But not only that, he is risen for a purpose, just as he lived with a purpose, just as he bled and died with a purpose. We all know how difficult, how painful, and just how awful life can be at its worst. And we know how evil can be so strong at times. We know that evil has consumed many, many people, and so much that is good in the world. We know that people get sick and die. But we also know deep within ourselves that life is inherently and ultimately good, that life is a blessing, and that life has a purpose, and that even when life is broken, even when some life is extinguished, the hope of God never ends, for Christ is risen. I love the story about blood transfusions because it reminds me that however bad things look for people, as difficult as life gets, life is also wonderful. That your blood, that my blood could help someone else when they're at their lowest, well, that's just amazing. And I also love the clear purpose of Easter morning, especially as it's described in Matthew's Gospel. That whatever the political and human reasons behind Jesus' death, God has a deeper and grander purpose. A deeper and grander purpose that even the stones proclaim. So go and share this good news, this salvation, this healing, this new life to the other disciples, then to your friends, your family, your country, and then to all people on earth. For we are reborn for a purpose. We are reborn for a purpose. In a time of lockups and lockdowns, many people are feeling purposeless because the routines of life have been suddenly and abruptly interrupted. We cannot do the jobs we used to do. We cannot see the people we used to see. And for those of us whose identities are tied very closely to what we do, things are especially tough right now. And so I think it is now that the gospel is particularly important, because we are rediscovering this Easter morning that our purpose comes from God, that we are not defined by what we do, but rather by who we are in God's eyes, beloved children, along with the beloved Christ. Amazingly, you and me and all of us are shaped and formed for lives of gratitude and generosity in the light of the cross and the resurrection. And so I invite you again to share the good news with each other and with the world, to find ways to always be part of the solution and not the problem, and to find peace not in the things you have always done, but in the promise of God that there will always be new life. For this is what we proclaim. And so, to finish, let us remember some of the things Christians have been doing lately. We remember that Christians couldn't meet in person for Palm Sunday rallies last week, but have continued their advocacy and support for refugees and migrants in Australia and around the world. I know for a fact that Christians all around Australia have written letters and they have called their politicians. They have spoken to their friends and families and will continue to do so, all in the name of supporting those who come to this country from overseas. We also remember that the churches have been in the face of our politicians to insist that the massive economic package designed to keep people in jobs and the economy ticking over, that this package will not exclude people who have come from overseas, that it will not exclude workers on temporary or protection-related visas. If we can afford to be generous this year, we must be generous to the most at-risk people. We remember too those Christians who have been advocating on behalf of childcare workers and gig economy workers and all those who might be falling through the cracks right now. And finally, remember all those Christians getting ready to send aid and even to go to the poorer countries of the world as the pandemic begins to ramp up there. I know that my uncles and aunts are already engaged in work to support the poorest people in South Africa. And in places like South Africa and many other countries around the world, the biggest fear is not whether they can go to the shops or not. It will simply be whether they have enough food to survive. And so we remember the churches and the NGOs and the governments who are trying to address this potential catastrophe. You see, friends, Jesus bled and Jesus died and was raised not to prove that God was all that, but rather to spark a revolution of grace, a revolution of forgiveness, love, and sacrifice amongst his followers. Inspired by the hope of new life, we are all called to carry forth the spark in our generation. Let's get to it. Amen.